We've seen a lot of these emulation handhelds come out over the last, I'm going to say like 2 years. I guess it's gone on a little longer than that, but especially in the last year or so, it's been an accelerated release after release after release. And we sort of hit a point where the hardware inside of these cheaper devices are pretty much expected and they're known now, so we sort of have an idea as to the performance, and it's been more about the form factor that companies like Anbernic have been working around. Well, we did have an announcement for one that I was pretty excited about. It's something I've been asking for quite some time, a form factor from way back in the day, the early 2000s, that's now made its way to current hardware. And that's the Game Boy Advance. And now, going into 2025, to me, it seems like we have one that is well priced and actually works really well. So we're going to go over that here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure that like button and subscribe if you're new. I'm going to start things off a little differently here. I want to take a look at the price first thing. So that is the Anbernic RG34XX. It is now available. I had put an order in for this a little while ago when they first went up, and it just came in this past week. And it is currently priced here at $69.99. Now, there are so many different things you can option here technically, where you can get different SD cards installed right from the manufacturer here. I just did the Indigo 32 gigabyte no game. I guess you can get some where they put games on it, but I just went for basically the cheapest option here. It still does come with a screen protector, little wrist strap piece here, and it does have a charge cable. So there is no charge brick in here. Keep that one in mind. You'll have to get one yourself, although most people now, I'm sure, do have some sort of charge brick for cell phones or maybe another retro handheld that is laying around at this point. But yes, we're working with a $70 handheld. To me, that does still fit in that impulse buy territory. At this point, it's the same price as a brand new PlayStation 5 or Xbox title at that $69.99 price. So let's start by taking a look around the box here. It does have a nice logo graphic right on the front of that RG34XX, along with the text here at the bottom. Otherwise, though, all the way around, there's not much else. I mean, the back is just like just flat white. And on one side, you do have the different colors they offer with a little check mark for my Indigo side. Opening it up, though, we do have the system right away. It's in like the styrofoam plastic sort of bag. And then on top of the system, they do have this styrofoam piece that's mostly there to protect that front screen. It has nice cutouts for some of the different buttons, so it does lay flush across the front and isn't pressing down on the buttons while it's in shipment. After removing that, though, you can see the screen protector down here underneath of it. You do have that charge cable in that white side compartment here. Comparing the system to an original Game Boy Advance, it's actually pretty close. Now, it's not exact since it is a bit bigger. You can kind of see that in the comparison here between this and the black Game Boy Advance that I had laying around. Otherwise, though, the button orientation, the shoulder buttons, kind of the look of it, it all lines up really, really nicely, and that does translate over to the feel of the system when you pick it up. It legitimately feels like a high quality, almost first-party Nintendo device. Again, it's very, very close. There are some things, though, of course, that'll set itself apart, which if we take a look around the system, the front for the most part lines up, other than the two buttons that are above A and B. Those are colored the same as the Indigo shell here, so it sort of blends in and doesn't necessarily take away from that Game Boy Advance look with A and B being front and center with that nice like light gray look. We do have that power indicator light there on the right, the one speaker grill at the bottom there. We have the D-pad on the left, start and select, and then the nice big screen here in the middle, which is, I think, a big selling point of this. So with some of the other models, which we'll also discuss those compared to this a little later, but the screen for those are more multi-purpose, as I would describe it. This screen is set up perfectly for Game Boy Advanced games. They have it set up with like that 3:2 aspect ratio, coming in with a resolution of 720 by 480, which is 3 times the size of the resolution for the original Game Boy Advance. So what that means is when we play games on this, it'll scale up and look great even when full screen. We don't have to stretch or do anything weird to the image for it to work. On top, we do have an HDMI out. We have our USB-C in for power or data transfer. We have a reset button, and then also a menu button. And then on the back, where you normally have your cartridge slot, you have 2 micro SD slots. One of them for this model is filled with that 32 gigabyte SD card, as well as L2 and R2, which are in some we'll say, strange positions. And this is what I mean about this device being geared towards one specific system, and I'm sure you can guess which one, but L2 and R2 are there, I think, mostly to support PS1 games, and then even certain PS1 games, because not all of them technically will work great on this system, but they are at least there just in case you fire something up that needs it that technically still fits into the idea of the Game Boy Advance controller layout. On the bottom, we do have our power button, you have a headphone in jack, and then you have a volume rocker. It sort of takes on the idea of like the rolling volume switch that you would have on the Game Boy Advance. However, it only goes left to right a little bit, and then it clicks back to the center. So it's more or less simulating that look of it while keeping the functionality of a typical just pressing up and down for your volume. And then on the back, not a lot to write home about here. We do have a removable door for the battery, which itself is also removable. It just plugs in, so it is at least easy to replace. Now, I did power on the system, but I realized I didn't have any games or anything on the SD card. So after turning it on, I turned it right back off and went ahead and dropped the SD card into the system, into my computer, and just moved over some games. I did notice, though, when I first turned it on and checked the SD card, the file system format, everything is already set up with the different folders, so it's very easy to just drag and drop your different ROM files in place, and then it'll populate on the menu the next time you start it up, which we can see here. I have PS1, DS, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy. I also had a Dreamcast game on here, but it didn't show up, at least in this menu. I had to move over to RetroArch to start that up, which we'll discuss some Dreamcast stuff here a little later. First, though, let's just start up Game Boy Advance right away, as again, this is the primary reason you would be picking this up. And I gotta say, the screen, the aspect ratio, everything, it looks awesome. Now, they do have a couple of different filters you can use with these different games. So as I was going through, say, Gunstar Heroes, it was very frantic. It moves around a lot. It wasn't skipping a beat there. And then jumping over to things like Castlevania, same deal. And as I looked through some of the filters, Dot Matrix is the default one. I think that looks the best. The reason I say that is because I think it simulates the look of the Game Boy Advance screen. They have HD. Doesn't look bad or anything, I think anyway. It just cleans it up almost a little too much. It just, for some reason, it takes away some of the experience for me, specifically for the Game Boy Advance look. I needed to have some of that, the retro crust on the screen. I don't know how else to describe it, but I mean, it is there, and it again, it doesn't look bad. It just looks different. It looks very, very clean. Game Boy Color also looks good here, and because we are dealing with a Game Boy Advance screen size aspect ratio, you will have borders for pretty much everything else, and that does include Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Now, you can turn these borders off if you would like, and then because the screen itself is just blacked out completely, and it does stay pretty dark on the parts that are not lit up, it looks very good. Like, you don't really see the edge of the borders and then the screen where that starts that well. You have to really be looking for it, and if you're paying attention to the game, like Shantae, for example, you're not really going to notice it. So, I think it sets up really well here for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Even playing NBA Jam from way back in the day in monotone color looked awesome, played well. So this, to me, is the system right now. If you're in the market for a Game Boy Advance and you keep looking at like those modified Game Boy Advance systems that are you then go to the price and go, oh, it's like $200 to $250 for one of these things that's all tricked out and everything. I mean, this is a pretty good option, to be honest, at $70. And yes, you would be emulating a lot of the stuff, but Game Boy Advance emulation has gotten pretty good at this point. However, because it's mostly geared towards Game Boy Advance, Game Boy and Game Boy Color specifically, it's also not a great system to get if you want to play pretty much anything else. Now, I will say with Anbernic, they do have many other devices that are more multi-purpose and are geared towards playing, say, PS1 or Dreamcast or even Nintendo 64. I think the one that I play the most right now, and I've actually been going through a couple of games on it, now I have to move some of those Game Boy Advance games to this, is the RG35XXH. It's the similar setup here where it has the landscape like the landscape control setup, but it also has multiple joysticks. I think the top buttons, the shoulder buttons are set up a bit better, and it's just more or less expecting you to play other systems on it outside of Game Boy Advance. So, for example, when you see me play PlayStation 1, while it does work, I am technically limited when it comes to maybe analog sticks you would use for certain PS1 games that would need it. And then also, while it runs well, as you'd expect, again, the specifications for this are well known, and they've been used quite a bit. We have an H700 quad-core ARM Cortex-A53, 1.5 gigahertz, dual-core G31 MP2, and then 1 gigabyte of LPDDR4 memory. All that comes together in a package that will play PS1, most N64, I'll say, pretty well. And then even Dreamcast. That's kind of the roof for this thing. But because we are dealing with a Game Boy Advance setup, it's just not that compatible with most of the stuff. I would say out of those, though, PS1, probably at least a library of games that will be the most compatible with a D-pad, 4 face buttons, and then a couple of shoulder buttons, some of which kind of out of the way with L2 and R2. Still, though, I did load up the Dreamcast just to see. Crazy Taxi ran great. I like to use this as kind of that benchmark game. It's just one that I played so much of back in the day, and it's so fast and frantic all over the place as you're going through it. Well, if you're playing it correctly, that is. You should be crashing and running all over things, right? Again, ran fine. You run into some situations where A and B are kind of mixed around and stuff with this out of the box. Now, that's the other thing I will say about this is typically with these Anbernic devices, these emulation handhelds, you'll have different OSs release later on, custom OSs. So what I'm showing you here is the out-of-the-box experience without much, if any, modification. I did also connect it to Wi-Fi because if you have that and RetroArch set up, you can sign in and get retro achievements now on the website, so it does come fully equipped with Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth. And then finally, I did boot up DS games because, believe it or not, on some of the other retro handhelds now with, again, how emulation is set up, they've sort of been able to overcome the need for that touchscreen in many different games. Some have it completely patched out, like the different Zelda games on the DS. This has been kind of removed and replaced with D-pad controls. Others, though, you can press and hold a shoulder button, and it'll prompt a little hand, and you can click things there. But the issue with this, once again, that aspect ratio kind of messes with the idea of a split screen setup, and you can see, again, out of the box experience for DS, not great. I fired up 007 Bloodstone for some reason and started to go through it, and it was not a great experience. Sonic was a little better, but I'm still dealing with a tiny screen on the bottom and then a larger screen on the top, so I guess some of the images that are supposed to flow between the two screens don't look quite right. So you kind of see what I mean when I say this isn't necessarily a multi-purpose device, not because it can't run the games, just because it's completely geared around the Game Boy Advance, sometimes to a fault. Of course, I did want to open it up and take a look inside very quickly, and I say very quickly because these systems just aren't very complicated, and they have to be very simple to meet this certain price quota, in this case of $70. On the back, though, I mentioned that battery door. It does come off with just a Phillips head screw. The battery is sort of like taped in. It has a pad underneath that has some adhesive to it, so you have to slowly sort of rock it off of there, but it will pop out, and it's just plugged in. It's a 3,500 milliamp hour battery, and they claim 7 hours per charge, which if you're playing it maybe sporadically through a day, whether it's on a lunch break or during a commute or something, it should get you through the entire day. Now, if you're going to play for long periods of time, you may want to bring a power bank or at least just be near an outlet at some point to charge. The rest of the way, at least on the back, they use these really annoying screws. I have to imagine it's just to keep people out of this. I don't know. They're not quite torque screws. It's like this weird shape, but different torque screws drivers will at least fit in there. Once you find one that catches, it's pretty straightforward. Remove some of the screws on the back, and that whole back plate will come off. It does have a ribbon cable at the top that's connecting the board on the top there that has your SD cards as well as your different shoulder buttons there for the back. And you know, the one thing I will say about L2 and R2, and technically even L1 and R1, is they're very quiet, and that is something that I do appreciate about certain handheld systems, is when the buttons aren't like incredibly loud. They're not these micro switch clicking ones where you know if somebody's playing a fighting game because the D-pad is for some reason clicking away. Not the case in this one. Almost like a stealth system in terms of button pressing. So not a bad one to play in bed if maybe you have a spouse around that's trying to sleep. Otherwise, though, you can see a couple of things here, which includes our little rumble motor as well as our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip to the right. The antenna does run up into the side where one of those gray side pieces are for the Game Boy Advance, or in this case, the RG34XX, and it's a clever spot to put it. My only issue is that's probably where your hands are going to be. Like, it's going to be wrapped around and maybe even covering that antenna. I can't speak to any kind of interference or unreliable Wi-Fi signal for this, as I just haven't used it for, months on end or something and come across that. Just keep in mind, that is technically where the antenna is, so, I mean, it's hard to avoid it, but maybe don't keep your hand directly over it when maybe you need it to connect to the internet to play against other people. We do have our screen cable here under some tape that I'm going to go ahead and disconnect. And then I just have to take out a couple of Phillips head screws, and the main board does lift up, which when flipped over, we can see our main H700 chip. Not really anything too surprising here. I will say, though, the board itself is quite thick. Like, it's not a flimsy board that's going to bend and creak easily on you. You have to put a lot of pressure into it here just to get it to at least contort a little bit. And then looking around when it comes to the buttons, specifically the D-pad, which is usually what I'm most curious about in these cases, it does have a nice big pivot point in the middle, so you shouldn't get many false presses when you're rolling around or going like left to then right and then back again. It shouldn't have any kind of weird presses that are popping up if you're doing a fighting game or even just a platformer in general and you need those precise presses. Oh, and then the screen itself is basically encased in plastic, as you can see, so it has a bit of a support mechanism to it, and for repairability, it's not great because it's on the other side of the shell. But I will tell you this, outside of the battery having issue, or maybe a stuck button, which you can get to, maybe you got to clean it out or something, I don't really see these systems as ones you're going to repair, because let's say you break the screen and then you figure out how to source it, then you go through trying to change it out and any other parts you might need. You might be more than halfway to that $70 mark, and then you go, well, in that case, instead of spending all this time working on it, I'm just going to buy another one. So these do sort of sit on that edge of almost disposable at that $70 price. So it's probably the better choice to make sure that the screen is well supported, and in this case, it is. It's just has that drawback of really no easy way to repair the screen if it does break, so keep that in mind. But overall, I really do like this RG34XX. I wouldn't buy it for anything other than Game Boy Advance, Game Boy, or Game Boy Color, because if you want to play anything else, there are many other devices you can pick up from Ambernic or different emulation handheld manufacturers that will tackle a wide array of systems with analog sticks and probably a more, I guess, bearable aspect ratio, again, depending on which systems you're jumping between. But they targeted the Game Boy Advance. They were very clear about that up front, which in a way I do appreciate because they really went for it. And I honestly think they knocked it out of the park with the overall feel of this system, the design. It's all there. The performance is good. So yeah, you know what? If you're looking for a Game Boy Advance system that has a nice screen, has a good feel to it, is a bit more modernized, and yeah, plays all the ROMs you want to throw on an SD card, the RG34XX is probably the move, especially at $70. It makes it a very easy recommendation. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below, especially if you picked up one of these RG34XX systems. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.